Claire, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to be here.
Yeah, so you got a fascinating background, including, and I don't know how I first heard of you, but years ago, I learned that you were one of the early employees at Twitter. An actual number, employee number 51. Is that true?
It's actually not a true number, but I am.
It's not. Well, that's what Mashable said. Are you saying that Mashable did not tell the truth?
Isn't that funny? I often think about how that was quoted in some article one time years ago, and then it just kept getting repeated. I actually do, truth be told, I do not know my employee number, and I'm unclear where you look. It's on some stub somewhere, but I don't know it. Isn't that funny?
It was early days, was it?
Yeah, it was more or less. Yeah, I once said in an article that I joined and there were about 50 people there, and that's what it turned into.
Oh, there you go. Well, believe it or not, everything you read on the internet isn't true. Did you know that? Anyway, I would like to talk a little bit to start out. We're going to cover a lot of ground today, but the early days at Twitter. I mean, it's fascinating. I've listened to the stuff coming out of Silicon Valley for years, had a chance to visit there a number of times myself, but those are kind of heady days. Take us back to sort of what that moment was like in the mid to late 2000s in Silicon Valley.
Sure. So, I mean, the way I ended up as an early employee essentially was because I was an early user. At the time, I had been traveling around the world and blogging about it, and then ended up living in this orphanage in Kenya where I was also blogging about my experiences. And for those who know a little bit about the history of Twitter, Twitter actually was incubated at blogger.com. And so if it was 2005, 2006, and you had a blog on the internet, you were probably writing it at blogger.com. Yeah. So essentially, I was typing my words, but, tripping on words.blogspot.com, like the longest blog URL ever. And the Twitter folks found it and started to promote it. And then essentially said, the blogger folks found it and started to promote it. And then said, we're launching this new service called Twitter. Why don't you join and start tweeting about your adventures in the same way that you were blogging about them? And so that was sort of how I got started on the platform. Obviously, there weren't many folks in Kenya. There weren't many folks doing what I was doing at the time. And I started to build a following. And eventually, within, I guess, about a year or two, that led into me becoming an early employee out at the company. And I initially started, I was in business school at the time, and I just started with a 3-month kind of internship to write my thesis. And then at the end of that time, just essentially stayed. So it was definitely an exciting time. One of the early stories I remember, not fondly, but with humor, is sitting in the office. There are about 50 people, and we got a knock on the door. And my friend, who was sort of working as like a BD person and a receptionist and kind of everything all rolled into one, goes to the door, answers the door, and it's a user. And the user is having a problem uploading her profile pic, right. To the platform. And so my friend helps her and all this kind of stuff. And she comes back and tells us about it. And, we say, that was nice of you. Weird that the user could just knock on the door and that kind of thing. And she said, yeah. And the weirdest part was that the profile pic was very revealing bikini photo. So it was just, the days, it was just what's going on. It was just a very, very different time.
Yeah, no kidding. And so around that time, were you at Stanford? Were you studying at Stanford at that time? Or were you in England studying?
I was in England. So I did my MBA out at Oxford. Oxford has an incredible program for social entrepreneurs. And I had been coming out of this nonprofit that I was running in East Africa. So had been granted this scholarship to study up there. And it was an incredible experience.
Oh, that's awesome. Awesome. So you have the coolest username too, right? You got Claire at Claire.
I did not get it initially, though. Another thing that people do not understand. No. Because when I first joined Twitter, I had the name of this long-winded blog name as my Twitter name. So that was definitely not my first Twitter name.
Right. But Jack Dorsey, is he like at Jack and, Bizstone? He got, I guess when you start the company, you can get some pretty cool handles. Did you have any idea? This is one of the questions that I think is circulating now in a different light. But did you have any idea that social media would become what it has become at that time? Because Facebook was starting to really gain traction. Instagram was, I don't think even around at that point. I think that started in 2011. I mean, when you look back at what you thought this would become, what did you imagine it would be?
Yeah, I mean, so when I joined Twitter back in 2009, the speech, the opening to the speech I would give most often about how Twitter and how social media more generally was going to be used as a force for change and a force for positive good in the world. At the time, the beginning to the speech I would always give would reference the fact that, when Twitter started in the end of 2006, people thought it was just something that you would use to tell people what you're eating for breakfast, right? And so even in 2009, which was 2 years into it, but only 50 really employees into it. So those first couple of years didn't see a ton of growth on the company side. We were still getting the same kind of feedback and pushback in a lot of news media. People just simply didn't understand that it was actually going to make a big change in the way that not only individuals approached the world, but in the way that, communities and governments and social systems did. And my role, I had come from this nonprofit background, and the thesis I wrote on Twitter was about corporate social innovation. So that was my first role at the company. And what that meant essentially was that Biz Stone, one of the co-founders, had this belief that Twitter could be used as a tool for good. And so he wanted someone to proactively push that agenda. So that was kind of what I was tasked with in the early days and throughout my time at the company. But in later years, I had some other mandates as well. And so for me, it was incredibly powerful to watch kind of these early firsts. The summer of 2009, you had, the island nation of Moldova having this revolution, and people called it the first Twitter revolution because the people were able to organize was through Twitter, right? In January of 2010, you had the hurricane in Haiti, and that was the first time that we really understood that Twitter and social media more generally could really be used in disaster relief, right? So I mean, we were seeing these moments building up. And, eventually within a few years, by 2013, 2014, we sort of recognized its power. And then, it's sort of all this curve, because then by the time you get to 2017, we started to see the limits of its efficacy and the problems that came along with it. So it's been really interesting, I should say, to watch the last 10 years of sort of our understanding of social media kind of come and then grow, I should say.
Well, it's interesting, because I think we're all kind of watching what's happening, not just on Twitter, but on different platforms now. And the things that were initially empowering also empower a toxicity that I'm not sure any of us really realized was as big or as profound. Any thoughts on that when you look at, and Twitter now, I mean, there's a lot of, you have to be really careful. I think Donald Miller even said in the bio to your book, you try to stay away from Twitter sometimes because it can be depressing. I'm still on it, and we're trying to use it for good, trying to use trying to be some of the good people on the internet. But some days you feel like, wow, there's a lot of strange and a lot of toxic out there. What are your thoughts on that, Claire?
Sure. I mean, I like to say that 2018 was kind of the worst year of social media's life. That's really the year where we started to understand, okay, what is this doing to our brains? Our inabilities to focus and to concentrate. What is this doing to our adolescence? We look at potentially increased suicide rates in girls and boys as potentially a connection to their social media use. And we look at sort of what it's doing to political systems throughout the world, in terms of what we call these filter bubbles, or these basically, these information silos, right? Which is that idea that I go on Twitter or I go on Facebook and I read the things from the people I already follow. And so then I become more entrenched in my own views, right? And so it's kind of the exact opposite of what we called, of what we initially thought of social media. We used to call it an open information platform. And the reality is, yes, it's open information, but that phrase doesn't address that information is weighted differently, right? So that's how you end up with these silos and these filter bubbles. I think that social media is a tool that can be good or bad. And I think we are seeing it now used very widely in both ways. And I think now what is happening is just that we are realizing that we as individuals actually have to use more self-restraint and be more in control of our use on these platforms. In the past, we just sort of thought they were good things and kind of let us all use them as much as possible. And now we're saying, hey, it's not really like that. We do have to mediate things. That being said, I'm a marketer, and I do believe that if you want to sell anything at all these days, you're going to be online. And if you're online, you really got to have some kind of presence on social media. It's your most ubiquitous and your least expensive marketing tool. And the reality is, as with many things, use and moderation is okay for individuals.
Yeah, and that's hard to get to, but just to, I guess it's become so much more than anybody thought it was even a decade ago, and revealed a lot more. Like this was not really the trajectory that anyone had in mind, would you say? I mean, they're conspiracy theorists, not in the crazy internet sense, but you listen to people like Tristan Harris or so on and so forth, and there's a variety of really thoughtful people weighing in on social. I want to shift gears, but I just want to see if there's anything else you want to say on that before we move on.
I would say I think my final thought would be, so Tristan Harris, and he has the Center for Humane Technology. It's a great initiative. I do think the one challenge I would insert into his mission, I would say, and this larger sort of mission to kind of take technology back, as I like to say, is I do think one of the problems in the creation of social media as we know it was a lack of diverse voices early on. And so I just want to be clear with ongoing initiatives like the Center for Humane Technology that I do think they've got to really push the agenda now to make sure they've got diverse players and diverse people weighing in, because I do think some of the kind of systemic problems we see, a perfect example would be bullying, right? On a platform like Twitter. Were not really understood thoroughly simply because you had a really homogenous group of engineers creating this stuff. And I mean, Evan Williams, the co-founder of Twitter, he's acknowledged this. He's said straight up, had we had, more women or people that looked different at the table in those early days, we might have thought about some of this different stuff differently. So I just want to make sure that kind of stays forefront, stays top of mind as we look towards changing.
That's fair, and it's a good note to everybody leading something or starting something today too, right? To look at your own biases and even the unconscious biases you might have, or the direction that you might have. Okay, this is going to feel real random, but I got to ask you a couple of questions while I got you. Okay. And again, the internet does lie, so if this is wrong, correct me. But I believe that I either read or heard something that is attributed to you a few years ago. And I'm actually writing a book on this that comes out next fall about how to leverage your time. And you said something like, even the most brilliant engineers at Twitter probably only had about 3 great hours a day in them of coding. True? And if so, what do you mean by that?
I don't know if I said exactly that, but I believe exactly that. And I would say it works just as much for an engineer as for anyone else. I mean, there's lots of sort of studies showing how long we can as individuals actually focus and actually be productive. And the reality is that you can't really, no matter what you do, no matter how much sort of coffee or how much isolation or how much, you in a creative, beautiful space feeling inspired that you add into the mix, you've really only got a few hours a day of really good productive time. And so I think one of the biggest kind of mistakes that certainly companies like these tech companies have or make is just by getting people to try to work all the time, right? And they do that with free food and with gyms and all this stuff, which is helpful, but those things would be helpful if you didn't make them work all the time. I just saw on Twitter, I don't even know what company it was, but it was a company that reduced all employees to a 4-day work week and then saw incredible productivity gains and things like that. I'm always super fascinated by, because I think it's what all the studies are showing. The less we work, the more productive we can actually be. And, there are folks that say, hey, if you figure out, your biological prime time, as they say, so the time of the day in which you're most productive, that time of day, you can actually be, like 100 times more productive than you at 4 p.m. in a sluggish post-lunch state, for example.
I would be one of those people who completely agree with that. I think that's very, very true. One of your earlier books you wrote on scheduling your day. So you have 3 children, is it? And Yeah, you've written multiple books. You've been involved in some really fast-paced startups. You're a tech advisor, also a startup advisor and an investor. I mean, you got a lot of balls up in the air. So do you want to speak to everyone who's juggling a lot? What are some of the strategies, the rhythms, the habits that you've employed that have helped you try to keep it all in the air, have your sanity, and still have time for interviews like this?
Sure. So I think one of the big things is trying to compartmentalize my life as much as I can. So,
Okay.
there are a lot of people that talk about this, but trying to do the whole, when you're mom, and when you're at work, you're at work thing. I think it makes you sort of more productive when you're at work. But it also makes you enjoy both sides of the coin much, much better. I think there's nothing more stressful than like having a small child yell at you while you are trying to respond to an email on your phone, right? You're not doing either thing well in that scenario. So trying to kind of separate out those worlds as much as possible. I have a friend, Crystal Payne of Money Saving Mom, who I think last year did this whole experiment where when she got to the end of her workday, and she has a home office like you do, but when she got to the end of her workday, she would leave her phone actually in the basement, the office she has, until the kids went to bed or something like that. And I love sort of little experiments like that, because I think the reality is we all have a lot less self-control than we think we do. And so putting up those sort of barriers helps us to live better, essentially. For me, the challenge is always kind of the disconnection. I went through many years of not having email on my phone. It's been back on my phone for about 4 months now, and I don't like it.
Uh-huh.
And I've got to get back into the rhythm. And, I went through many years of not looking at email at all during the weekend. And I would say about 3 months ago, I sort of slipped back into both of these patterns again. And it's been a challenge. It makes me feel more exhausted when Monday morning comes around. You know what I mean? So I want to get back into that.
Why and how did you cut it out a few years ago? Because that's a really important strategy. I've moved it to a third screen on my phone and sometimes delete it when I'm on holiday.
Sometimes delay when you're on holiday.
Mhm.
So I actually it was when I was writing this book, Design Your Day. So maybe about 6 years ago, that was when I was kind of doing all this research into productivity. And that was when I said, okay, I want to get this off my phone. And then interestingly, I'd been doing it for a few years. And then the thing I did that really convicted me of its kind of power was I did maybe 2 years ago, I did a 21-day detox.
Oh, yeah.
Nothing. So no, my phone was just a dead weight. I didn't have phone or email or social media or anything like that for 21 days. And that was super interesting to me. And it definitely made me more convicted about, trying to compartmentalize my life and trying to not always be online. But it also did something that was surprising, which was show me that I think sometimes we can idealize the lives that we think people led before technology. In those
Right.
21 days, there were a couple times where it was very clear to me that if I had my phone, life would actually be significantly easier at this exact moment.
Yeah. Okay, that's good. And then you put it back on because you were in the middle of writing a book. That's it.
And then 3 to 4 months ago, I just kind of fell out of the habit. I think it was following a vacation where I felt very frazzled and just kind of put them back on my phone again. And it's so easy when you do something like that to realize that you don't have the self-control often to stop it.
Any other hacks that have really helped you try to balance family, work, and the various things that you're doing?
Meditation, exercise, and then a morning routine. Those are kind of all mainstays. I have gotten really into meditation about 2 years. About 2 years ago, I got really into it. I tried it for years, but the thing that changed it for me was finding an application that I actually really liked. I use the Calm app. I use it every day, and I swear by it. I think it's just super helpful. I think being able to listen to a guided meditation, it makes it easier to do. So that's really important. And then making sure, I exercise, and then having a morning routine.
What's your typical, because we do have the majority of the listeners are young. They've got kids right in the zone, kind of where you're at right now, with kids still very much at home, very much dependent on their parents, not teenagers. What do the first few hours of your day look like?
Well, I think this is the big thing that has shifted since I've had children. My daughter is almost 6, and then I have 2 boys who are 3. And for me, the big thing was realizing that actually at this stage of life, morning routine for me it's not going to be the first thing. And I think that meant for a long time that I wasn't doing it because I said, oh, I can no longer do it first thing, so I don't need to do it. And so for me, what happens is I end up at the office about an hour and a half to 2 hours after getting out of bed. And that first hour at the office is devoted to me with coffee, doing my morning routine. So doing expressive writing. I usually do expressive writing, journaling, and then some type of motivational or devotional reading, essentially. And that first hour is essential. It's so funny because I do it in my office co-working in the kitchen part of the co-working because I like to do it away from my desk. I want a different space for that first hour. And a guy came up to me just yesterday and was like, what are you always doing for a whole hour every morning without your computer? And I was like, it's the best hour of my day. It's the best hour.
Oh, that's a really good strategy. Actually, is saying, okay, if I can't get 6 a.m. or 7 a.m. or whatever the wake up hour is, if I can't get it, you're right. A lot of people would just write the day off and go, well, so much for that. But to actually make a break and start your day there, I think is a really good idea. Okay. So a couple other questions for you. Just when you look back on your leadership, what would you say this far in have been some of the greatest challenges that you've faced as a leader?
I think one of the challenges that I've faced is having kind of a multi-passionate career. I think that is something that we see more and more, and we see it as more and more popular. Obviously, you were an example of that.
Yeah. By multi-passionate, can you just talk about what that means? Multi-passionate?
You have a few different interests that you feel are very strong, and maybe they all have one sort of North Star, and maybe those interests, either the interest could be one North Star with multiple ways you express it, like a podcast and then a book and then speaking, or it could really be maybe two kind of diverging interests that you want to. I
love that phrase. It's good.
And I think for me, that was tough to wrangle with because some of my favorite books of all time and some of my favorite leadership teachings of all time are all about, focusing on that one thing, right? I love Essentialism by Greg McKeown. I love The One Thing. I love all the stuff Michael Hyatt talks about this, and I believe it, but it kind of has always conflicted in my head with how you deal with having a few different kind of missions in life or ways you express that one mission.
Oh, so how have you navigated that multi-passionate career path?
Yeah, I think I've just tried to make things like, the tenets that are talked about in Essentialism or in The One Thing, I've tried to kind of make them my own and realize that, I'm never going to have exactly one thing on the goals list or the vision board or whatever it is that is going to be the absolute priority in a given year. And I think I will have a couple. And I think that actually just based on my personality type makes me stronger in the other things that I do.
Yeah. Okay. Would you say, no, this is really good. Would you say that there's a thread there, Claire? I had a couple of people speak into my life. I remember one day I was listening to, I think, a podcast by Reid Hoffman. I had another guy coaching me. And it occurred to me that of all the various things I've done, the one common thread, and I didn't see this until a few years ago, was communication. Whether that was law, I gravitated to the courtroom. If that was ministry, I gravitated toward the sermon. If, here I am sort of in this entrepreneurial space, and what am I doing? Podcasting, writing books, speaking. It's all communication. Would you say, looking back at your variety of things, can you distill a common thread that kind of like, is it all entrepreneurial? Is it all like, what would you say it is that really...
So the way I think about it, and I've thought about this a lot, is that there are two things that I kind of consistently thrive at in all areas of my life. And one of them is basically content creation. So I really like writing and I really like speaking. And then the other thing is connecting, because I really like connecting people to people. And so those things happening a lot. And when I'm not doing one of those things, I think I'm really outside my sweet spot. Like not in my sweet spot, I'm saying.
I bet you for a lot of people who are multidisciplinary or multi-passionate, if you look through, you probably find a thread there. There probably is a thread. Okay, good. What's been surprisingly easy? Like most people on the outside would be, oh, that's got to be tough. And you're like, no, actually, it's pretty easy. What's been easy in leadership for you or life?
I mean, I think one of my superpowers is just really, I really enjoy connecting with people. I'm a total introvert, but I love connecting and I love making those connections. And I think my brain just kind of does that. You know, I see someone, I meet someone, I think, oh, you should talk to B person, and then B person should talk to C person. And that's just one of the things that I completely love doing. And so that has really never been a challenge for me. I feel like I can, go to some conference and drop into some city and, randomly find 10 people to have an interesting dinner with that night. That's something that I'm good at.
That is a superpower. Okay, so your latest book, it just came out, is all about the difference between between social media success. And I want to start by talking about the difference between brand marketing and direct marketing. So can you clarify those terms for us?
Yeah, so I think this is super important. And when I was kind of just coming up with this new book, Social Media Success for Every Brand, one of the pain points that I developed this book really out of was this real mistaken idea people have that social media should lead you directly to a sale. So you should be able to put up a social media post on Twitter and then you should see someone buy your widget. And if you don't, then that means that social media didn't work, right? And so
Right.
one of the ways I really began to kind of think about this, and one of the things I talk about in the book, is that I think most people mistake social media for a direct marketing tool when really it's a brand marketing tool. So direct marketing, or direct sales marketing, is I send a marketing message and you purchase something as a direct result, right? Brand marketing, in contrast, is marketing for the sake of creating awareness about the brand and engagement around the brand. So these are very, very different goals. And one of the things that I see all the time in startups I advise or invest in is this immediate complaint upon joining a new social media platform that the sales aren't rolling in. So, basically the whole new book that I wrote is all about looking at why social media works for brand marketing, and then how you can get people interested in your brand and then lead them up what I call an engagement ladder, to the point at which then you can make a direct sale or make a direct ask of them, and then see the sales that you actually want.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, when I've thought about this in the past, I think car companies do something similar. You think about a vehicle, you might purchase one somewhere between every 4 to 10 years. I don't know what the average would be. And yet you see car ads every day, right? You see car companies are advertising every day, but it's not like, oh, wow, I saw that billboard. I'm going right into the dealership and I'm going to drop $35,000 right now. But we expect that from social.
I think I've never thought about that in terms of cars, but that's a perfect example, right? We don't mind that we see these car ads. That's really interesting, actually. Right.
Yeah. And so the idea is you need to be out there. And I think what I find fascinating about this, it's a partnership with Don Miller and the Storybrand people. And I'm an avid listener to the podcast and reading a lot of what Don is writing over the years. But you've taken his Storybrand framework and adapted it to social media. So can you walk us through some of the broad strokes of that adaptation, Claire?
Sure. So, I mean, the background to this is Don and I have been friends for about a decade, and I love the Storybrand marketing framework, and it's something I've used with startups that I've worked with a lot. But one of the challenges that I see with it is that there was never really an exact plug and play model for then using the Storybrand framework on social media. The framework, if you've been through it or if you've read his book, Building a Storybrand, is really great for showing you exactly what you need to do on a website and what you need to do on an email newsletter. But it doesn't go into, what I call the third kind of pillar of digital media, which is social media. So that was kind of when I came to him a couple years ago and said, hey, this is amazing. I love Storybrand for my clients, but I think we need something related to how to use it exactly with social media. And he said, hey, why don't you create it? And so that's where this came from. So essentially what I did in the book is create a 5-step model. I call it the share model, and it walks you through really exactly how to go about doing this. And the first step in the model is figuring out the basic Storybrand framework first. So you understand your story and how to tell a clear story before you do anything else. And then it's kind of the next 4 steps of the model are taking you through kind of the practical logistics and some of the theoretical ideas about how to really post well on social and how to see results.
Yeah, I think one of the things Don has done really well, and he's changed the conversation, I think, in a lot of circles on this, is it's like, stop being the hero of your own story. If you look at every good novel, every good movie, every good, story that gets told in human history, the idea is that there's sort of a guide, and then there's the hero and the hero struggles. And so his big thing is, no, make in my case, the podcast listener or the audience or the reader, make them the hero. Do you want to talk about that a little bit as it applies to social media? Do we still try to make ourselves the hero?
We try to make ourselves the hero all the time. And one of the ways we most do that is the type of content that we promote and that we send out on social. So one of the big things I try to encourage people to understand really early on is that your social media platforms are really like a bank account. And in order to keep your bank account in the black, you need to be depositing more than you withdraw. And depositing in the world of social media is about creating valuable content. And then withdrawing is when you make that call to action. You ask someone to go to your website and to download your PDF or to even buy something or to share your product with a friend, right? But so it's really, really important when you think about making sure that your customer is your hero to make sure that 80% of the time you're really depositing value, giving them things that matter to them. Because that's really the key to keeping people around and keeping people as your followers on a social media platform. And obviously, you don't just want them as your followers. You want them to then move up this engagement ladder to become increasingly engaged with you, up to the point that, they are these diehard fans, essentially.
Yeah. How do you do that? Like, what can you give us some concrete examples of content that you think would not be about you versus the direct ask? Like,
Sure. So, when in the book, we walk through exactly how to create kind of the perfect editorial calendar for your brand and the perfect social media schedule for your brand. But I think on a macro level, the most important thing that happens before that is to figure out which platform is actually for you. So one of the things that I think is really valuable about the book is that we have this social media evaluation. And in it, I basically just created an evaluation that any brand can take to figure out which platform matters most to them and which should be their priority platform. Because I cannot tell you the number of brands or startups I've worked with who have said, hey, we just put all our content on Facebook, but no one cares. And so social media doesn't work, right? And I say, well, what's your brand about? And they say, oh, well, I'm a recruiter. I'm an executive coach. And I say, okay, well, take this evaluation, but I'm going to bet before you take this evaluation that Facebook is not going to be your priority platform and that actually you're going to see a lot more success on either LinkedIn or Twitter, right? So each of these platforms is really good for different things, and people often do not realize that. You talk about, we mentioned Twitter earlier on. Twitter is, the superpower of Twitter is connecting people, right? So if you are looking to recruit someone, if you are looking to invest in a startup, if you are looking to find a thought leader who might be able to share the good news of your latest book coming out, all those types of things are perfect on Twitter, and they pretty much suck on most of the other platforms, right? In contrast, if you are a blogger and you have a lot of content, you produce, and you want a lot of eyeballs to that content, you're going to see way, way more success on either Facebook or secondarily Instagram, depending on if you have good images or not, right? So it's really important to figure out what platform before you then start thinking up what kind of content is going to work best, because the different platforms have different types of content that really work for them.
Right. Do you want to take us up the ladder a little bit, the engagement ladder, sort of talk about that? I'd love to drill down on that, Claire.
Sure. So, basically, I like to say that social media in many ways is like a cocktail party, right? And so if you think of a cocktail party and you think of, what are your goals when you go to a cocktail party? Your goals are probably to have a good time, maybe meet someone, to maybe meet someone that you connect with and maybe exchange business cards, to maybe follow up at a later date, right? Your goal at the cocktail party is probably not and should not be to, rush in and run up to your ex-boyfriend's, husband's, wife's, roommate and try to sell your latest healing essential oil, right? That just doesn't work. It's going to be the guy at the cocktail party no one wants to talk to. And so when we think of social media like a cocktail party, we think of, okay, how can you stand out in a positive way and potentially make a connection that on both sides might lead to following up at a later date, right? So you can send out valuable content perhaps to make that happen, right? Stand out in a positive way on social media with the hope that then someone will follow you, which is the first step on that engagement ladder. And then as you walk them up the engagement ladder, as you continue to share good content with them, you're hoping that, first they follow you, then they maybe respond to you on social media, then they maybe share one of your posts with someone else, then they maybe click on your website URL, then they maybe join your email newsletter, then they maybe open that email newsletter, then they maybe make a first purchase, and then they maybe become, one of those diehard fans. So that's kind of the example of how that engagement ladder works. And the specific rungs of the ladder can differ from brand to brand, but that is really the overview. And the idea is that, social media as this incredibly ubiquitous tool that is oftentimes free or nearly free is one of the best ways to get people on that ladder in the first place. And then you're going to use some of these other digital media tools to pull them up the ladder while you're still connecting with them on social.
Can that be a long sequence sometimes? The engagement ladder?
Absolutely. It can be an incredibly long sequence. I mean, I've had folks on my email newsletter for 10 years. And, some of those people actually open regularly, but, they're not interested on any of the things to buy yet, and maybe they will one day, maybe they won't. But for them, it's been a really long ladder so far.
Well, it's interesting, because there's one guy that I've been a fan of for a long time, Ramit Sethi. And, and I've followed him online. I think it started with an email newsletter. And then I started following him on social. I was really engaged. I got all the sales emails, but I would read his emails, but never click. And then a few months ago, as our team needed to do some training, I went in and bought one of his courses. His courses are not cheap. Not cheap. I mean, they're multi-thousands of dollars. Yeah. And I'm like, there's a great example. I was thinking if I was Ramit Sethi, I might think, this guy has no interest in me. He reads all my emails. He's never going to do anything. Then all of a sudden, one day, I decide I'm flipping a switch and I made a major investment. Is that typical? Is that what can happen?
I do not think that's typical. And I think, Ramit's a friend of mine from college, actually. I just saw him at our reunion and I've done the same with him.
Because you were both Stanford, right?
I finally bought one of his very expensive courses last year. I think he would probably tell us, if you are, really targeted towards online marketing, that you would probably not want to keep that person around that long. You probably want to shorten the cycle to some extent. But, everyone's different.
So you were at that reunion. My wife and I were actually right next to Stanford at the Stanford Park Hotel while that was going on. And I thought, I'm just going to crash the party, but I didn't do it. So...
It was really hot that day. I mean, October in Northern California was always hot. But that was, wow. I was like, yeah.
But it was a good time, was it?
Yeah, we had a great time.
Yeah, not a total, this is a bit of a detour. But Stanford has produced a lot of incredible graduates. Any idea what some of the secret sauce is there?
It says $50,000 palm trees, I got to tell you. Have you heard about that?
No, I have not.
I remember we got there as freshmen. We went on some, tour with our freshman dorm resident advisor, of campus. And the thing he told us that I repeat to this day, I have no idea if it's true or not, is that on the main sort of entryway on Palm Drive, each of the trees cost $50,000 to fly in from Russia or something. I don't know. So
that's it. That's the secret. Okay. We know. Okay, back to the main story. I just had to throw that in. So the engagement ladder and the time sequence. What are some keys to getting people to move up? Because I know there's a lot of churches putting content out there that they think is valuable. There's a lot of businesses. It's like, wow, I've shared like, if you're in real estate, I've shared 5 ways to prepare your house for resale. Got free information out there. What are some tricks or tips, I should say, not so much tricks, but strategies to moving people up that engagement ladder a little bit sooner?
So one of the things is you've got to make sure to have calls to action. So I say, 80% of the time you're depositing, and then 20% of the time you're withdrawing and doing a call to action. I just did a LinkedIn Live with someone who has a really large community of HR professionals on LinkedIn. We were talking about my book, and I was sharing the engagement ladder, and he was just like, wow, I really never call people to action, and he was telling me he's had his business for X number of years. He's got all these thousands of people, and he's never asked them to buy anything, right? And they all just sort of buy some of it. And I'm like, this doesn't work. So I think this is something Ramit talks about also. It's a little bit of, you do have to train your followers a bit to understand that they are going to get some sales messages from time to time.
Right.
And some people are just not going to like it. I mean, here I come out with, one book every 2 years, and I sent a few emails the week my book came out to, 20,000 people on my list. And this one guy, he must have responded 3 times with just these horrific messages about, stop shilling for your book. I will never buy it. And you're thinking, why are you here?
Yeah.
Right? But so there are always going to be people that are going to complain, even if you are selling your list about, even if you're just telling your list about the book you write every 2 years. And those people probably are not meant to be there. So you want to kind of, train people on social media and in your email newsletters to accept the fact that you're going to be, calling them to action occasionally, but you're not going to be doing it all the time, and you're not going to be pushing it down their throats. I think one of the biggest problems on social media is just that people think it's like a billboard, but really, really small. And so you can just push a market at people all day and all night, and you really can. I mean, people will unfollow you.
How do you respond to people like that guy who emailed you 3 times? Or do you just like read it and let it go?
I didn't let it go. I mean, I try not to read any of those kind of responses. I try to get them not shown to me. I think that's just too much negative energy.
But you can't win,
I think
right?
That was almost, you can't win. What can you do? And honestly, why is he on my email list? It's crazy, right? But there's always that.
That's like Seth Godin-ish. Those people are not for you, right? Like that's not your audience. That's not your target.
Good. That's good.
No, I know. Right. I've got a fairly large list, and I used to be paralyzed when I saw people unsubscribe. And now I've just resigned myself. I send out a daily email. I'll get 20 to 50 unsubscribes a day on a list of about 55,000. But I will always, unless it's a really weird day, there's always net gains, like way more people subscribing than unsubscribing. And do you look for traction like that to see whether you're hitting your, like, too many unsubscribes and not enough subscribes can tell you something? Or how do you gauge whether you're connecting in the right way, I guess, is the question under the question.
Well, I mean, on social media, the way you figure out if you're connecting is the engagement metrics you see in terms of the posts you're sharing. So on Twitter or on Facebook or on LinkedIn, you're seeing what posts are actually working and what aren't, and some of the best posts that you will find will always be what I call pattern disruptors. So, in my book, we talk about coming up with a social media schedule and an editorial calendar, but one of the best things you can always do is then go a little bit off course from time to time, right? So
let's talk about that.
I share a story. So I share a story in the book of one of my favorite mentors, Marshall Goldsmith. He's this big executive coach, and he has a couple million followers on LinkedIn. And one of his most engaged posts of last year was just a family photo he posted around Thanksgiving, right? And the reason that was so engaged upon is just because LinkedIn, you think of as a professional network. You don't think of it like Instagram where people are sharing those types of photos. And so it was a total pattern disruptor. And it was obviously really an easy post for him to create. It was just a family photo, but it got tons of engagement. I think family stuff, when that's not your norm, is always going to do that. But any kind of pattern disruptor can really be a net gain for your following.
So anything that is, I think you said in the book or somewhere, I think I was reading that for your sabbatical, or you really scaled back, right? And then all of a sudden, when you did jump on, engagement went through the roof. Is that right?
Absolutely. So, I mean, I've seen that a few times when I've gone offline. Once, intentionally for this 21-day digital detox. And then another time, a few years ago, I had twin boys born really early. And so I spent a number of months with them in the hospital, not really doing a lot of tweeting or posting on Instagram. And I really saw very clearly when I did during those times, it was nuts how engaged upon my posts were. And I think most people will tell you the same thing. The problem is, though, you don't want that to be the norm because that doesn't build a consistent following, of course.
Right. So just occasionally do
reliably. Yeah.
All right. Well, as we wrap up, I love asking this question when I get social media experts on, what's the difference between a leader's profile and the organization's profile?
Sure. Well, the specific definition will change a little bit depending on the platform you're using. But essentially all you're saying is just there's a profile on a platform like LinkedIn or like Twitter, or like Facebook, that's for you as an individual that either could be you as a dad and human and dog walker, or it could be you as a leader in your organization. You kind of get to choose. And then the organizational profile is just all going to be about the organization. So I think, in this day and age, you see more movement towards having the person be integrated within the personal brand. So you see a lot of these personal accounts that are doing some business stuff at the same time. So that's kind of an interesting crossover.
Yeah, Richard Branson comes to mind as somebody who's done that fairly well.
And that's a really effective and important part of his personal brand. We would all feel like he disappeared if we didn't continue to see, him kite surfing in Necker Island from time to time, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. But, I've run into a lot of senior leaders who are like, you know what, my organization, my church, my company, they're online. I don't need to be online. Thoughts on that for senior leaders?
I think it's a limited, short-sighted strategy. Obviously, if an individual is really against social media and is never going to be personally engaged, the amount to which a media team can sustain that individual around them can be limited. In general, I think senior leaders can really benefit their organizations by having some type of presence. But again, the whole thing I talk about in this book is figuring out your one priority platform and caring about that. So not caring about the 10, 20, 30 new mini social media platforms that are out there, and instead focusing on the one that's actually going to move the needle, and then putting some effort into that, but not crazy effort by any means.
Well, lots of information here, Claire, that's been super helpful. And your book is really detailed. It's not theoretical. Well, it is theoretical, but it's like super practical. And I look forward to walking my team through it. But for the leader who's like, okay, in light of everything I think I half know about social, what is one good step in the right direction? Or do you have like, hey, just try this. Okay, today before you go to bed, try this. What would you say that would be?
The absolute number one thing you want to do on any social media platform is to create. So it doesn't matter how many times Mark Zuckerberg changes the Facebook algorithm. Engagement is always going to give an account greater reach and ultimately greater followers. So you want to create engagement. And a really, really easy way to do that is to ask a question. So that would be a great first step for anyone listening.
Yeah.
And then be there to respond.
Right. Don't just ask a question, come back in 2 weeks, right? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. That's really fair. Claire, tell us one more time about the book, where they can find it and where people can find you online.
Sure. So the book is Social Media Success for Every Brand. You can find it on Amazon. We also have a great free video series at socialmediamadesimple.com, which is basically a five-part video series that can give you some introduction into some of the insights in the book. And you can find me at ClaireDiaz-Ortiz.com.
Okay, that's awesome. And at Claire on Twitter. Back to where we started.
On the Twitter. Claire on the Twitter.
All right, Claire, thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me.